Max.
Kurt.
So you were, I first knew of you as a conservative, as a Republican. I think we met in a green room at MSNBC when you were the conservative that day. This book you started actually in 2014, started working on it, I believe?
2013, yeah.
13, which is to say, in the before time, which is to say, before Donald Trump ran for president the first time. And I just want to say to you and the audience that you don't hit hard the theme of, oh, look at this guy, Ronald Reagan, and how he became president, how he was president, as a prism through which to look at Donald Trump. I could not read it without using that prism, so forgive me if I, in today's conversation, default to that sometimes. But did you do that? Is he, let's just say the current president, the current Republican president, who has a portrait of, as you reminded me a moment ago, of Ronald Reagan on his wall, did you exclude him because it's a biography of Ronald Reagan and people can draw their own conclusions, or because when you were finally writing it and they're finishing it, Donald Trump was no longer president, and so who cares?
Well, first let me just say thank you very much for having me here. It's truly a privilege and a pleasure to get to spend a weekend in this charming city. I can't believe I've lived this long without having been here, and thank you to the Literary Festival for rectifying that. And thanks to all of you for coming out here, because I think the culture of books and reading is just so incredibly important, and it's something that is endangered in the age of social media. So it's wonderful to see so many people who are dedicated to books and the printed word. I think that's incredibly important for our future. In terms of whether you know the current president looms over my biography of this former president, I mean, to some extent, I guess that's inescapable. But as you mentioned, I mean, I started this in 2013 when it would have seemed like science fiction to imagine that the host of this reality TV show could possibly become president of the United States. So it certainly had nothing to do with Trump, my motivation for starting this book, which was really just this notion that Reagan was this incredibly important and consequential president. I grew up in the 1980s, so I had vivid memories of the impact that Reagan made, and it was just this. The impetus for the book was simply the observation that there was not, while there were many books about Reagan, there was not a great biography. There was not a definitive biography about Reagan, and so I set out to write that. Now, of course, as you mentioned, a few things happened in the meantime, including the election of Donald J. Trump as president of these United States in 2016, and which made me, after a lifetime as a Republican, re-register the next day after the election as an independent. And I think in many ways, the advent of Trump, while it has not been a very good thing for this country or for the world, was probably a good thing for me as a biographer and historian, because it pushed me out of the Republican Party, and I think it gave me some greater objectivity and distance in writing about this Republican icon than I would have had in prior days when I thought of myself as a conservative and a Republican and part of this movement. And so I think it was a very good thing for me, just from my perspective as a writer, to gain this greater objectivity about the person that I was writing about. And I couldn't escape Trump entirely, and I alluded to him briefly in the introduction and the conclusion, and of course many of the reviews, in fact most of the reviews, I think have heavily focused on the Reagan versus Trump angle. But I didn't really want to make this a book about current politics. I really wanted to keep very few mentions of Trump in there, because Trump was not an important player in Ronald Reagan's life, and so I really wanted to make it about Ronald Reagan, and you can view it through the lens of the current politics or what have you, and I'm sure many people will.
Do you think the book, to me, seems very down the middle, and for a person who, until he was 40-something, was a registered Republican and considered himself a conservative, takes a kind of liberal critique of certain aspects of Ronald Reagan, how he pandered to the George Wallace voters in the South and elsewhere in terms of racial bigotry, and other effectively liberal critiques of this conservative hero. Would you, if you, in the alternate history where you don't cease becoming a Republican in 2016, have written the same version of Reagan's life?
Really hard to say. I mean, I didn't, because again, I wasn't trying to write a liberal or conservative account of Ronald Reagan's life. I was trying to write an accurate and objective account of Reagan's life, and that meant grappling with not only his successes, but also his failures, his strengths as well as his weaknesses. And I really, I tried to view his life from my perspective as a biographer and historian who was trying to be as objective as possible. And there were certainly things that Reagan did that I felt he could rightly be criticized for, at least from our current prism. And I, put those out there, but I also put some other things that he did that I thought were more admirable, and I've, let readers, make of it what they will.
One I didn't know. One of the many things I didn't know about Ronald Reagan until I read your book is the way in which the specifics in which he sometimes pandered to bigoted white voters. For instance, about the Voting Rights Act, a thing he said in 1980. I mean, that it struck me in retrospect that in 1980 that would have been a remarkable thing, if you can go tell that detail.
Well, Reagan was a very complicated guy, and in many ways he was more liberal than the current Republican Party, especially when it came to immigration, because he was very much pro-immigration, and in fact signed a legislation that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. But his record, so while he had a pretty positive record, I would say, on immigration, and would not refer to illegal aliens and use this other kind of terminology, which has become de rigueur for the Republican Party today. His record on civil rights was actually a lot worse than I realized when I went into this book, because I'm not sure that most people realize or realized until recently that he was opposed to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He was opposed to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and there was a lot made of his trip in 1980 after the Republican convention to the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, which was near the site where 3 civil rights workers had been slain by the Klan 15 years earlier. And Reagan gave this now notorious speech in which he endorsed the idea of states' rights, and many people have since excoriated him for this, although at the time it was actually surprisingly uncontroversial. And when Jimmy Carter tried to make an issue of it, there was a massive backlash from the press corps telling him that he was being mean. But what's striking to me is that, and I write about the Neshoba County Fair and I went into it pretty deeply, how that came about, and Trent Lott, for example, was a major mover in that, and so forth and so on. But what's striking to me is that this was not at all out of character, because people now treat it as if, wow, they're shocked that Ronald Reagan is endorsing states' rights in 1980. Well, actually, if you go back to the very beginning of his political career, his first run for governor of California in 1966, he was opposed to the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which was legislation in California to outlaw discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. And he made no bones about his opposition to civil rights legislation or the way that he exploited white fear after the Watts riot in 1965 to run on a law and order campaign. So this was a consistent theme throughout his political rise. And that's something, going back to your point about, is this the liberal critique of Ronald Reagan? I guess maybe it is, but this is just the reality of Ronald Reagan. This is what actually happened, and how significant you think or what you make of it is really up to you.
Well, and to the is he a liberal or by today's standards, or what is he by today's standards? I didn't know how pro-choice he was as governor of California. You make an extraordinary statement about that.
He signed, there's this mythology around Ronald Reagan, and there's actually two sort of competing. there's a lot of mythology to suggest that he was this pure conservative who never deviated from conservative orthodoxy, and that's just not the case, because in fact he was often very conservative on the campaign trail, and what I uncovered was he was really conservative, especially in the early 1960s. I mean, he was echoing a lot of things that the John Birch Society was saying about how the Democratic Party was leading America to communism. I mean, this was a general theme of Reagan as a speaker and as a campaigner in the early 1960s. And in fact, at the time, he was saying that Medicare and Medicaid was socialized medicine and would lead to the extinction of freedom in America. And by the way, when Jimmy Carter called him on it in a 1980 debate, he used that immortal line, "There you go again," to suggest that Carter was being mean and a bully. But Carter was right. This was actually Reagan's view at the time. But so it's interesting. What I found, which was very interesting, was in many ways, as a campaigner and as a speaker, he was even more extreme than people remember him today. But he was able to pivot as governor and as president, and he had this streak of pragmatism that enabled him to actually make compromises and to deal with Democrats, whether it was Jesse Unruh, the Speaker of the California Assembly, or Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. And his record was often very much at odds with this conservative caricature, and a conservative caricature that in many ways he played into as well. So, for example, yes, he signed, as governor of California, he signed one of the most, maybe the most liberal abortion law in the country. He signed a very tough gun control bill. He constantly excoriated the University of California, including my alma mater, UC Berkeley, but nevertheless raised state funding for higher education by a large amount. And one of the most interesting interviews I had in the course of doing this book was with Jerry Brown, the former governor of California, and of course the son of Pat Brown, the governor that Reagan defeated to become governor in the first place in 1966.
And a fellow Hollywood actor.
Yes. Who was a fellow Hollywood?
Oh, George Murphy.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, George Murphy was the
yes,
senator.
Right.
Was the senator.
No, Jerry Brown's father was not a Hollywood actor.
So I asked Jerry Brown, what did you think of Ronald Reagan as governor? And his answer surprised me. He said, I thought Reagan was a pretty good governor. Wasn't expecting to hear that. But his record as governor and as president was actually much more centrist and moderate in many ways than most people expected.
Well, which is, again, I was, a teenager when he first ran for president, and it seemed to the mainstream as though that's a joke, he'll never become president. Then I was working as my first journalism job really at Time Magazine when he became president, and very quickly that sense of moderation, partly as a function of who surrounded him, but as you depict in the book, his instincts to not go for the John Birch far-right Goldwater conservatives, but to expand his audience, to be the president of many people, which worked for him politically and otherwise.
No, absolutely. I mean, he made common cause with the Christian right, with Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, all these groups to become president of the United States. But then he did very little to advance their agenda. He never went and spoke at the Right to Life rally. And I talked to one of his aides who once asked him, Mr. President, you keep talking about how abortion is murder, so why don't you do something about that? And his reply was, politics is the art of the possible. You got to focus on what you can get done. And Reagan in his first term, and Reagan and his advisors were very tightly focused on what they wanted to get done, which was to revive the economy, to revive the military, and that was pretty much it. They didn't have a lot of room left over for focusing on social issues, and they didn't want to engage in, in culture war type of issues. And Reagan really believed in expanding his coalition and not driving people out of it, and he was just extremely pragmatic. And there's the kind of the ultimate tribute to his pragmatism, and a lot of the reason why his first term was pretty successful was who he chose as his White House chief of staff. He chose Jim Baker, which was in hindsight seems almost inevitable, but at the time was very unexpected because Jim Baker had worked against Reagan twice, once for Ford in '76 and then the second time for George H.W. Bush in 1980. They were hardly pals. They barely knew each other. And everybody expected that Ed Meese, who had been Reagan's chief of staff in Sacramento, would also become chief of staff in the White House. But Nancy Reagan, Stu Spencer, Mike Devers, some of the other folks who were close to Reagan knew Ed Meese and knew that he didn't know much about Washington. He was notoriously disorganized. People always joked about Ed's bottomless briefcase where you go in the document, you never see it again. And they just knew that while Meese had the same ideology as Reagan, and he was seen as kind of the keeper of the conservative flame, he was just not somebody who was set up to be effective in Washington. They knew that Jim Baker was this very smooth inside the beltway operator, and so they convinced Reagan to make Jim Baker the White House chief of staff, and he was, became known as the Velvet Hammer, this very ruthless but very pragmatic guy who didn't believe in grandstanding and made a lot of compromises. And so as a result of that, Reagan passed a massive tax cut, and then he passed, when that led to record-breaking budget deficits, he then agreed in 1982 to a massive tax increase bill. So he was willing to compromise his ideology, and this was something people didn't understand about Reagan, because again he projected this image as an ideologue, but in fact he had nothing but contempt for conservatives who go over the cliff with their flag flying, as he often said. He often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want today and come back for more tomorrow than to hold out for everything and get nothing. So he had this very pragmatic approach to governance, which I argue was really the secret of his success. And I think a lot of folks on the right want to think that the secret of his success was his conservative ideology, and I argue no, it was actually his ability to put his ideology aside in the interests of governing.
And why, when he was up for re-election in his second term, he won 59% of the popular vote in 49 states.
Yes. No, it's a stunning achievement. Just think about how surreal it is to imagine anybody running for president of the United States winning 49 out of 50 states, and yet Reagan did, because again, he was, although he could be divisive on some issues, by and large, he was a uniter, and he sought to bridge differences with Democrats rather than attacking them.
So you've just spent a perfect and beautiful 5 minutes on what is implicitly like how different he is than, say, the current president in so many ways. But then you say that his inattention to management and incessant hostility to government allowed chaos and corruption to run rampant. And he often behaved like a bystander in his own government. Talk about that and how familiar that sounds these days.
Well, what I like to say about Reagan was that he was a great leader, but a very poor manager. He was very good at inspiring the nation, and he was a master communicator. And that wasn't just a question of reading teleprompter speeches, although he was very good at reading teleprompter speeches. But one of the people that was closest to him and that I talked to the longest for my book was a fellow named Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant dating back to California in 1966. And Stu was really the mastermind of every successful race that Reagan ran. By the way, the one time when Stu was working against Reagan, not for him, was when Stu was working for Gerald Ford in 1976 in the primaries. And guess who won that race? So I was talking to Stu about Reagan, and what Stu said was Reagan was not only the best speech giver he ever met, but also the best speech writer. And this really went back to his days in radio in the 1930s, where he learned how to communicate very succinctly and in a way that really resonated with people who were out there listening to him, and he honed that as a spokesman for General Electric in the 1950s. So he was, very, very good at getting his message out, but he did not really have a lot of management experience, right? Certainly prior to becoming governor of California, but he tended to adopt a very hands-off CEO type of management style, in part rooted in the naive belief that everybody he appointed had his best interests at heart and you just trust them to do a good job and so forth. Nancy was much more suspicious and brittle, but Reagan tended to be extremely hands-off, did not get involved in the details of what was going on in his government or the details of legislation. So he really needed a very strong staff to make up for his deficiencies. And his first term, he had that, as I was discussing with Jim Baker, tremendously maybe the most effective White House chief of staff ever. In many ways, he was sort of like a prime minister. He was really the person who was running the government on a day-to-day basis. But then the second term got off to a disastrous start when Don Reagan, who was the Treasury Secretary, former CEO of Merrill Lynch, decided he was tired of that job and figured out that cabinet officials, even the Treasury Secretary, didn't actually have much power in the Reagan administration. Everything was run out of the White House, which is usually the way it works, and convinced Jim Baker to swap jobs with him. And so Jim Baker and Don Reagan at the beginning of the second term went into the Oval Office and said, hey boss, we're thinking it'd be a cool idea if we switch jobs. And Reagan, listened to him for half an hour and said, oh, okay, by me. Didn't really go into it too deeply. But then Don Reagan becomes this disastrous White House chief of staff. As Jim Baker said to me, Don liked the chief part of the title, but he didn't understand he was staff. He thought he was the president. And so, and he had terrible political antennae, so things went off the rail pretty quickly. You had, the Bitburg controversy where he visited the Nazi cemetery. You had, of course, the Iran-Contra affair, the worst scandal of the Reagan presidency. You had HUD scandals, all this other stuff. So things went off the rail when Don Reagan took over for Jim Baker, because Reagan just could not manage the government on his own. He really needed somebody who was good at that. And then finally, in the middle of the Iran-Contra affair, Nancy Reagan convinced the president, her husband, to fire Don Reagan, not because he had gotten him into a terrible scandal, but because he had yelled at her on the phone. And so he finally got rid of Don Reagan and brought in Howard Baker, who was a more experienced Washington figure, and then he righted the ship. And so when you had Howard Baker and then Ken Duberstein and Colin Powell, these other folks running the White House, the ship sailed pretty smoothly again.
And then Colin Powell and Jim Baker, who then became Secretary of State.
Jim Baker was Secretary of Treasury under Reagan, and then Secretary of State under Bush.
But Colin Powell, when he was NSC, along with the then Secretary of State and then Defense Secretary, you say, basically decided, they weren't getting much guidance in the second term from Reagan on foreign policy and national security. We're just going to do it ourselves, and did.
Yeah, no, that was after Don Reagan was fired. They brought in these other folks, including Colin Powell, including Howard Baker, Ken Duberstein, and others who were, pretty effective operators, and they basically decided, as you said, as they recalled to me, that they would try to resolve most issues before they would get to the presidential level. And sometimes, of course, you got to go to the president, but with everything else, they tried to just, meet in the White House every morning, 7 a.m. over donuts and coffee, and try to figure it out themselves. And that was pretty effective but it wasn't, I think people will suggest maybe this is like a betrayal of Reagan. This wasn't letting Reagan be Reagan. I think Reagan was actually pretty happy with this setup, because they were still trying to move policy in the general direction that he approved of, but he just didn't want to get involved in the details. So he needed somebody else to do that, or to make the hard, some of the hard bargains.
The single set of traits that you describe as Ronald Reagan having, and experiences from radio sportscasting through Hollywood, through candidacy for governor and president to president, is what you describe again and again and again as his blurring of fact and fiction, of fantasy and reality, which
could make good fodder for a book called Fantasyland.
Thank you. But it is, as I read about in that book, it was a Reagan caught that wave when it had already started with John F. Kennedy and television, and now with the current president has achieved some new apotheosis. But that I hadn't seen it done as well as you do, to show that in so many different ways he did that. And indeed, as you describe him, he never had any thought that he was lying, that he was doing this. He simply didn't distinguish between true and false, or what he saw in a movie and what really happened.
Well, I would say Reagan had a great devotion to the truth, but kind of the truth with what he saw as the truth with the capital T, this larger moral or ideological truth. He wasn't too worried about the details of smaller, granular truths and the facts that he used to support his grander vision. He actually was an inveterate reader, so he read a lot, but he also tended to be a somewhat indiscriminate reader. So he would read things that would basically reinforce his ideology, and then he would write them down on his index cards, often, reading magazines like National Review or Human Events or what have you. And he didn't often examine too closely, is this strictly speaking factually accurate or not? Because if he thought it made a larger point, like government is bad or communism is evil, that's all he really cared about, is to illustrate the larger point. And so a lot of the actual anecdotes and so-called facts that he used were a little too good to be true. And he had a somewhat cavalier attitude about factual accuracy. I was one of the interesting things I ran across in the course of this book research was this enterprising graduate student in the mid-1960s who actually examined one of Ronald Reagan's speeches and tried to fact-check his claims and found it was very hard to do. And so he actually wrote a letter to Ronald Reagan, and amazingly enough, Reagan didn't ignore it. He actually answered back. He wrote a letter back trying to explain to this young man the answers to his questions. And one of the things that Reagan often said at the time, this was a standard trope in his speeches, was to say that no country that has ever given 1/3 of its wealth to the government has ever remained free for long, which sounds on the surface plausible, except when you actually dig deeper and realize that even in the mid-1960s, a lot of European countries, the government was already taxing more than 1/3 of GDP. And of course, today that's true in the US and pretty much every other advanced industrialized democracy, without any of them becoming necessarily dictatorships as a result. So, but anyway, this student asked Ronald Reagan, as Governor Reagan, where did you get this assertion about that you can't remain a free country if the government taxes 1/3 of your GDP? And Reagan's reply was, well, I read that somewhere, but I don't have the original source anymore. So he just read it somewhere, maybe in National Review, Human Events or something, and it just lodged in his mind. And he actually had a steel trap memory at that time. So he remembered a lot of things, but they were not strictly speaking true, and he didn't care about probing whether they were true or not. And so there were like nuggets that there were these apocryphal quotes and statistics. He would repeat them for decades, and they would sometimes drive his White House speechwriters and aides to distraction, because they would they would take them out of his speeches, but then he would say them spontaneously because he had been saying it for decades.
It's interesting to think of him as this guy who became president only 16 years after Barry Goldwater, running as a ideologically very similar candidate, failed so miserably in one of the largest landslide losses in presidential election history. Is that just because, or not just because, what are the reasons that happened, do you think, apart from his personality, which seemed genuinely affable, optimistic, contented, all those things that Barry Goldwater's did not? Or was it also, or more, what had happened between 1964 and 1980 in terms of Vietnam and the 1960s?
I think you just answered the question as well as asking it, but I think it was both of those things. I mean, first off, Reagan's personality was much more pleasing and popular than Barry Goldwater's. Barry Goldwater was a kind of a hard-edged, castor oil type of conservative. And in fact, I quoted, I think, Joe Alsop or some journalist of the 1960s who listened to both Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan speaking. And of course, Reagan was a leading supporter of Barry Goldwater's in 1964. And his observation was that while Goldwater often turned off or didn't really engage his audience, the Reagan personality was like soothing, warm bathwater. It was very pleasant, and he always had a joke and a smile and some witticism. And so Reagan made the Goldwater message go down much easier than Goldwater himself did. In fact, this was an observation that many people made at the time, where they would listen to Goldwater and Reagan speaking on the same platform and say, gosh, maybe Reagan should be the candidate instead of Barry Goldwater, because he gets the message across better than Goldwater does. But the other aspect of it, as you alluded to in your question containing the answer, is there were also massive changes in the country between 1964 and 1980. Remember, in 1964, if you look at surveys of popular trust in the federal government, it was very high. It was, probably 70-80% of the public trusted the federal government. This was at a time when the federal government had won World War II, defeated the Great Depression, was passing this popular, had passed Social Security, civil rights legislation. The federal government was doing a lot of things that were very popular. We were launched in the moon race, all these other things. And of course, what happened in the next 16 years? Well, you had the Vietnam War, you had Watergate, you had stagflation, Iran hostage crisis, a lot of bad inflation, you had a lot of bad things that happened. And so by the time that Reagan was running for president in 1980, popular trust in the federal government was very low. And of course, you could argue in many ways that his campaign drove that popular trust even lower because he often vilified the federal government even when he was running it. And of course, one of his famous quips was, the scariest words in the English language are, "I'm here from the federal government and I'm here to help you." So he, but it wasn't just Reagan. I mean, even Jimmy Carter to some extent played into skepticism of the government because remember, he was this outsider from Plains, Georgia, coming into Washington to clean things up after Watergate. So it wasn't just on the right. There was a widespread skepticism of government. And so Reagan's anti-government message, which in many ways was the Barry Goldwater anti-government message, the country was just much more ready to hear it in 1980 than they had been in 1964.
Because, as you suggest, so much of the left during the 60s and 70s had become skeptical of government and government power. Yeah. When we talk about, he came across as this friendly, affable, regular guy, Mr. Norm. Was it an alias he used while he was traveling around?
It wasn't an alias, but this was what you're citing, I think, is one of my best sources, unexpectedly, which was the movie fan magazines of the 1930s and 40s, which did these wonderfully revealing interviews with leading actors of the day, including Ronald Reagan. And so this was one of his wonderful interviews from the late 1930s when he was at Warner Brothers, where he, in fact, you have to be a little bit skeptical of these interviews. They were to some extent ghostwritten. It wasn't like, it wasn't a pure journalistic enterprise, but it was certainly language that they at least signed off on. But, where Reagan described himself as Mr. Norm, that basically saying like he wasn't, anybody special. He was just your average American. And then he went on to list I can't remember the details, but he went on to list his tastes in books and movies and food and sports, and everything was just basically as regular as you can get, down the middle, exactly what viewers of Ronald Reagan's movies might be doing themselves.
But and the thing is, though,
aside from the fact when he was asked, he said, "Who is your favorite actress?" And of course, he had to say, "My wife, Jane Wyman." So that's not something that most viewers of his movies could say. But
other than that fib,
yes,
he was. It seems, as you portray him, absolutely genuine and real. This was not a show. The regular guy, the nice guy, the contented guy, the easygoing.
No, it wasn't. And actually, one of the most, I think, revealing experiences you can have in terms of trying to understand who Reagan was visiting his ranch near Santa Barbara, which I would commend to anybody who happens to be out there. It's a fascinating insight into his psyche, because it's a beautiful piece of property, and he loved riding on it and loved chopping wood and all this other stuff. But if you go to the actual ranch house, it is astonishingly modest. Okay, there are no gold-plated commodes in the Reagan ranch house. In fact, the decor looks like it was scavenged from a flea market. It's pretty clear that no interior decorator ever got within a mile of that place. It was this very humble place, and he kept it that way deliberately. That's what he wanted. And one of the most insightful interviews I did for this book was with a fellow named Dennis LeBlanc, who I'm pretty sure almost nobody has ever heard of. And yet, Dennis may very well have been Ronald Reagan's closest friend when he was president of the United States. And who is Dennis LeBlanc? He was a former California state trooper, highway patrol, who protected Reagan when he was governor of California. And along with another former state patrol policeman, Barney Barnett, they went to work for Reagan on the ranch when he left the governorship. And they basically became his part-time ranch hands. And these blue-collar guys, Dennis and Barney, were the two people that Reagan most loved spending time with in the world. He would go, at the ranch in the 1980s when he was president. He would go for a ride in the morning with his John Barletta, his Secret Service agent, who was the best horseman that the Secret Service had. And then in the afternoon, he and Barney and Dennis would go out in the Jeep, and they would, paint fences, move rocks, trim trees. I don't know. I've never worked on a ranch. Whatever you do on a ranch, they would do. And by the end of the day, they would get very, very tired, obviously, after doing all this ranch work. And so then they would come back to this very modest ranch house, and Nancy Reagan's housekeeper would prepare a very stingy meal for them because, she was always watching her weight. She was a size 2 and wanted to stay that way and didn't want Ronnie to eat too much either. And so by the end of the meal, the guys would get up almost as hungry as when they sat down, and then they would go into this, very modest living room and turn on their TV set and watch, Murder, She Wrote or some other show that was popular at the time. And then they would, like a lot of other Americans, they would fall asleep in front of the TV, and then at some point, the First Lady would kind of tap Barney or Dennis on the foot and say, time to go to bed, fellas. And so then they would, shuffle out the door, and if the housekeeper might feel sorry for them and slip them a couple of extra cookies on the way out, and they would go off to their trailer to sleep, and the President and the First Lady would go off to their extremely modest bedroom. And this was the place that he considered to be Valhalla on earth. He didn't want to see anybody else there. He just wanted to spend time with Dennis and Barney. And that's while he was President of the United States, most powerful man in the world, somebody who had been a star of stage and screen, but this was his preferred mode of living. So a truly, truly humble person.
So his accomplishments. If you had to say, let's say, 2 biggest accomplishments, as president, what were they?
I think he had one massive accomplishment in each of his 2 terms in office. His big accomplishment in his first term, I would argue, was giving America its mojo back, because we were talking about, the terrible time of the late 60s and the 70s with Watergate, Vietnam, stagflation, Iran hostage crisis. The nation kind of seemed ungovernable by the time he was elected in 1980. And a lot of people thought that our best days were behind us. But he had this kind of indomitable optimism about America, which was very similar to his boyhood hero, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He in many ways copied his presidential style from Roosevelt. And he had somebody who had voted for Roosevelt 4 times, worshipped FDR, listened to all the fireside chats, and really imbibed a lot of that optimism and that unwavering faith in America, which Roosevelt and then Reagan communicated to the rest of the country. And so, it wasn't really the Reagan economic program, I would say, that revived the economy. I think Paul Volcker, with his very high interest rates, which took the inflation out of the economy, I think that was primarily responsible. But it was really Reagan who kind of restored America's faith in itself, restored the armed forces' belief in themselves, and that's what made possible his 1984 campaign, in which he said it was morning again in America, and people believed it, and 49 out of 50 states voted for him. And then that set him up for his great achievement in his second term, which was making peace with Mikhail Gorbachev, which on its face seems highly implausible, because of course Reagan, his entire political career was defined as being this anti-communist hardliner. A lot of people thought he was a warmonger. People didn't realize at the time he actually abhorred nuclear weapons and wanted to abolish them. And so I think the turning point of the Cold War was in Geneva in November of 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan got together for the first time. And they didn't know what to make of each other. As Gorbachev later said, Reagan looked at me as the world's #1 communist. I viewed him as the #1 capitalist. But in 2 days of discussion, very much like this, sitting in armchairs much like this with an interpreter, obviously, they really reached a mutual understanding and came to see that they were both leaders who wanted the best for their countries, who feared war, who wanted to ratchet down tensions, who wanted to end the Cold War. And that's what really set the process in motion. And there's kind of a mythology about Reagan, which was embodied in this movie that came out about him a year or so ago, highly fictionalized movie. This mythology that he bankrupted and defeated the Soviet Union. I think what actually happened was somewhat different. I think the turning point of the Cold War was really Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power in 1985. And Gorbachev, I argue, was kind of a black swan, somebody who rose to the top of this dictatorial system while losing faith in the system and wanting to reform it. And of course, it was his reforms that led to the collapse of the communist empire. but I think it's very much to Reagan's credit that he was able to put aside a lifetime of anti-communist ideology and understand that Gorbachev, as Margaret Thatcher told him, was somebody you can do business with, that he could actually work with this communist to ratchet down tensions, reduce nuclear weapons, and end the Cold War. And a lot of people at the time on the right were telling him he was being foolish, that he was being duped, that this communist was taking him for a ride, but he was firmly convinced that he could work with Gorbachev, and I think history vindicated that. So that's his great achievement of the second term, was winding down the Cold War peacefully.
As a 7-year-old emigre to the United States from the Soviet Union, which people may not know about you, and then growing up in the United States from 7 to whenever one is an adult, was really the years of Ronald Reagan. How much did that form your the conservatism of the first 40 years of your life?
Oh, no question. I was a fan of Ronald Reagan growing up, as I think a lot of young people were at the time. He kind of made conservatism cool in the 1980s. And again, coming from this Soviet emigre background, like emigres from any other communist country, think of Cubans, for example, socialist country, Venezuelans, for example, they tend to be pretty much on the right side of the American political spectrum, and it's certainly not. That is the way I grew up, and I thrilled, when Reagan called out the evil empire and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But so that was no question. Reagan was a very meaningful president for me, and part of the reason why I wanted to write this book. But again, to bring it back around to where we started, I'm not the kid anymore who attended the Reagan campaign rally in Canoga Park, California in 1984. And I think the ideological journey that I've taken to a position of being a political independent, I think has given me a much more objective vantage point to look at Ronald Reagan than I would have had if I still had my kind of boyhood fanboy perspective on the president.
I have one question before we go to the audience's questions. You say, and this really struck me, that the two, FDR, what he did is something that Ronald Reagan did, which is to make Americans feel better about their country and themselves in these profound ways. And of course, Barack Obama, when he was running for president, said, and got into trouble for saying, Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in this fundamental way. So if those are the two people of the last 100 years who have done that, the two presidents, I would argue, I don't know if you agree, that Donald Trump is the third one who has changed the trajectory of American politics. But he has certainly not done it by making everyone feel better about the United States. How is which seems so bizarre to me in terms of one always thought that was part of what a successful president had to do.
It's bizarre to me too. What can I tell you? I mean, it's striking to me. I think this is accurate. I don't think Donald Trump has ever been over 50% approval, maybe for like 30 seconds or something, but almost never. Whereas Ronald Reagan was almost never under 50% approval, and it was considered normal in olden days for presidents to have more than 50% approval. That was just the norm, unless there was some major scandal going on. But we've just become a much more partisan and polarized country, and I think Donald Trump basically exacerbates that division for political advantage, which is a very different strategy from what previous successful presidents have done. I mean, again, whether it's Obama or Clinton or Reagan or going all the way back to FDR, or pick an example, presidents have tended to unite because obviously they think it's their job to lead the entire nation, and just from a purely practical self-interest perspective, they want to get as many votes, as much support as possible. They don't want to drive people away. So, it would never occur to Ronald Reagan to refer to Democrats as evil or, as all the other pejorative words that the current president uses. Reagan referred to Democrats as my friends, and he always took the view that he might disagree with Tip O'Neill or others on issues of policy, but that they both wanted the best for the country, and they just disagreed about some of the policies that would achieve the best for the country. And I think that was not only a noble outlook, but also a very practical one. Again, that's why he won 49 out of 50 states, which Donald Trump has certainly never come close to doing. But Trump in many ways has proven smarter than a lot of naysaying pundits, myself included, because I never thought he could be successful with this very negative, very divisive approach. But he's shown how to make it work, and I think part of it is kind of differences of communication. I think his approach works in a social media age where everybody has their own version of reality. Whereas Ronald Reagan was still president in the mass media age. He had to communicate through the three big television networks, through the major newspapers and magazines, and so there was kind of more, one of Pat Moynihan's famous lines is, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not everybody's entitled to their own facts. Well, that was true in Ronald Reagan's day. It's no longer true. Now everybody has their own facts as well as their own opinions, and I think Donald Trump has been a very successful president in catering to that, to the alternative reality crowd.
And winning by 1.5% is still winning in a binary election. So anybody who has questions, and I emphasize questions that end in a question mark, somebody will bring you a microphone. Sir?
Yeah, a question. Reagan was a devout follower of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, and as recently as 1948 campaigned for Truman. Okay, and then in his early middle ages, I think he was in his early 40s, he does a 180. He doesn't just leave the Democratic Party or say it's gotten too liberal. He goes right to the right of the Republican Party at that point. I mean, he's to the right of Eisenhower or what have you. How do you explain, except in the story he worked at GE, and that because he worked for GE, that made it happen. I don't know. I'm sort of confused how he does a 180 at that point in his life.
Well, that's kind of the central question about Ronald Reagan's life, and the explanation he always gave was completely unhelpful, because he often said, I didn't leave my party left me, to imply that the Democrats had gone far off to the left, which simply was not true in the 1950s. The Democratic Party was very centrist. I mean, remember, in 1960, Jack Kennedy ran to Dick Nixon's right on defense policy. So the Democrats were still very much mainstream in the 50s. It was very centrist, whereas Reagan was the one who really shifted. And you're absolutely right. There's a mystery about that, and that's something that I tried to unravel in this book. I traced the beginning of his political odyssey back to World War II, where as a very highly paid movie star, he was very unhappy to be paying wartime rates of taxation of 90% or more. Then after the war, his movie career was on the wane, and he became more actively involved in union politics, became president of the Screen Actors Guild, and then he literally had a front row seat to the war, to the McCarthyite period in the wars over communism in Hollywood. He testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee. He was an FBI informant, and he believed what the FBI told him, and Luella Parsons and others believed that there was this made in the Kremlin conspiracy to take over the Hollywood movie industry, which I found, based on my own examination of the Soviet archives, to be largely fictional. But he sincerely believed that, as did J. Edgar Hoover and others, and he thought that in his role as president of the Screen Actors Guild, he was preventing this communist takeover of the movie business. So that made him a staunch anti-communist. But as you mentioned, even as late as 48, he was backing Truman. He was still pretty liberal economically. And the rest of his political odyssey was really complete in the 1950s, when he became, after his movie career completely ended and he needed work, he got work as a spokesman for General Electric and host of General Electric Theater on CBS. And of course, he was one of two individuals ever to become president of the United States after hosting a national television show. But as part of that job, he went around the country giving speeches on behalf of GE. And GE in those days was a very conservative company, because GE management viewed conservative ideology as basically inoculation against union problems. And so they made sure that all of their spokesmen and managers and executives read all this conservative material, whether it was National Review, Human Events, Hayek, Mises, all this other stuff. And Reagan, in those days, had a lot of time to read because he was afraid to fly, and so he would take the train cross-country from LA to Chicago to New York to speak on behalf of GE, and he would be reading all these right-wing publications on those journeys, and then he would go out and give these speeches in which he would basically regurgitate a lot of these views. And that's where he really honed his message, which was that America was facing these twin threats of big government at home, communism abroad, and suggesting that, you know, as we expanded government with more social welfare programs, we were going to become communist ourselves. A lot of people were startled when, in 1964, Reagan made his national political debut with a half-hour program on CBS giving what became known as the Time for Choosing speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater. People were stunned. Here was this actor giving this very polished address on behalf of the Republican presidential candidate. What they didn't realize was he had been giving versions of that speech for the past 10 years. That's where he really honed his ideology and figured and not only formed his ideology, but also figured out how to communicate it, so that by the early 1960s, this one-time New Dealer, very fervent supporter of FDR was pretty far to the right, and that's how that transformation occurred.
And had 10 years, effectively, of stealth political experience, barnstorming across America.
Yes, that GE job was really his political education, that was where he first picked up, for example, his method of making speeches, which was he would write down facts, anecdotes, and arguments on these index cards, and then he would go in before a speech, he would shuffle the cards so he never gave the same speech twice. And then as he was giving the speech, as a trained actor, he would be judging the audience reaction, and cards that resonated stayed in the pile, the cards that didn't resonate went into the trash can, and so that's how he honed his message and really figured out how to communicate with people.
Could you give us a little color on Iran-Contra and how it came about? It seemed like Reagan didn't have a lot to do with the development of that. And was it appropriate for him to avoid any responsibility as much as he did?
Well, Iran-Contra was, the big scandal of the Reagan administration, and it basically consisted of selling weapons, missiles, to Iran to win the release of American hostages, and then the National Security Advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, and his aide, Oliver North, came up with a brilliant idea of taking the profits from the sale of weapons to Iran and funneling them to the Nicaraguan Contras, these rebels, even though Congress had passed something called the Boland Amendment, which forbade U.S. aid to the Contras. And so he was violating this congressional injunction against aiding the Contras, and of course he was also violating his own tough on terrorism rhetoric, because he was dealing with the hostage takers. I mean, the genesis of the whole thing was really that Reagan was a soft touch, and he was very worried about the fate of the American hostages, and he talked to their families and wanted to do something to get them out, and then he was manipulated by his aides, Bud McFarlane, John Poindexter, Ollie North, and others, into doing this deal. Now, but while the dealings with Iran were disreputable, they were not illegal. That was not an impeachable offense. Now, providing money to the Contras, that was potentially an impeachable offense. But what really saved, what kind of got Reagan into the Iran-Contra affair and got him out of it was the same thing, which was his completely hands-off, disengaged management style. Because once the Iran-Contra affair blew up in the fall of 1986, people wanted to know, did Reagan know about the diversion of money to the Contras? And of course he said he didn't know. Well, if Richard Nixon had said he didn't know something that his aides were doing, nobody would believe it, because they knew that Nixon was on top of every little thing that was going on in the White House. But when Reagan said he had no idea what his aides had done, that was actually a pretty plausible alibi. And there's never, I've never seen any proof to the contrary that he actually did know about the diversion of funds. So it was kind of a disaster, but in some ways his very cluelessness about what was going on turned out to be his salvation.
I enjoyed your book immensely, and for one primary reason was that you dished out criticism and praise where it belonged. There was no agenda behind it. Now,
thank you very much. I did not pay this gentleman to say this, but I appreciate it.
However, I read a book on Reagan quite a few years ago, Tip and the Gipper, And not knowing as much as I know about Reagan, having read your book, I had the impression that this relationship between Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan was some sort of gauzy, bipartisan relationship. I got the impression from reading your book that they really didn't get along as well as they seemed, the Tip and the Gipper seemed to imply.
Yeah, I think there's some people who romanticize the relationship between Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, and they were, first and foremost, they were political adversaries, and they did not necessarily love each other. I mean, Tip O'Neill referred to Reagan as the worst president of his lifetime, so he was not a huge fan. But I think what Chris Matthews was talking about in that book about Tip and the Gipper was that they didn't necessarily have to have a love-in in order to be effective in working together across partisan lines, and they certainly did that. And I mean, the Reagan White House certainly went out of their way to cater to Tip O'Neill to make him feel good, giving him tickets to the Kennedy Center and all these other kinds of things. Tip and Reagan could certainly swap some Irish jokes and stories when they got together. But at the same time, they were also political adversaries. But I think what made their relationship possible was not that they were bosom buddies. In fact, as I show in the book, Ronald Reagan had almost no real friends, and Tip O'Neill was certainly not his real friend. But they were both pragmatic, practical politicians who thought that they were in Washington to get things done, not just to make grand, futile gestures. And so they were able to reach across partisan lines and reach agreement on a whole bunch of legislation. And that was really what made that relationship possible.
I'm going to declare, first of all, thank you all for coming, but I want to declare the interlocutor's privilege to give you a minute to tell the audience about the book you're working on right now. Who are you writing a book about now, Max?
Well, Kurt, as it happens, I'm actually writing a biography of John McCain, so that's what I've been engaged in since this book ended.
And he seems like not only, I don't know that there's been a great biography of him, so there's that, but an heir to Ronald Reagan in a if there's a lineage of what we used to think of as conservatism and true conservatism, he was a descendant, no?
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, he was certainly a fan and supporter of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, although he actually, at that point, he had a somewhat difficult relationship with the president because Nancy Reagan really did not appreciate that John McCain had divorced his first wife, who subsequently went on to work for Nancy Reagan. So that made the relationship a little bit tricky in the 1980s. But McCain certainly thought of himself as a Reagan Republican, and I think was in many ways. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, this wasn't necessarily intended, but if you kind of put these books together, it kind of will tell the trajectory of American politics from, let's say, I mean, pick almost any point you want, certainly from the 1940s on to the present day, because of course Reagan left the political stage in 1989, and John McCain was elected to the Senate in 1988, and so he was, he becomes a central figure in American politics, just as Ronald Reagan is leaving the stage, and then he has various fights and causes that he champions, but I think there's kind of a recognizable strain of the Republican Party, which was embodied by Ronald Reagan and then by folks like John McCain, Mitt Romney, and others. And now I think getting back to the point you were making about what a transformational figure Donald Trump is, that it's really hard to recognize that Reagan, McCain, Romney, Republican Party in terms of what the party has become under Donald Trump. So that's kind of the meta story of the last, I don't know what, 40, 50 years of American politics.
Well, as a writer, I will not say, well, when are we going to see it? But I can't wait. So, Max Booth, thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
On behalf of Charleston Literary Festival, I'd just like to say a huge thank you. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you both for that fabulous conversation. Thank you, Kurt Andersen, for your warm, witty, engaged, erudite facilitation. And huge thanks to Max Boot for bringing your depth of research and knowledge to us here this evening. The door is open for that John McCain biography, so we can't wait to welcome you back. Two short notices from me. One, I'd like to once again thank the sponsors of this session, the McCausland Foundation, Bonnie and Peter McCausland, Martha and Orton Jackson and Huntington Bank. And I would love to remind you all that books make great gifts for people, and signed books make even better gifts for people. And Max Boot will be doing us the honour of signing in the signing lounge. So if you exit out the back of the theatre, you can buy books and have them signed right out there. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. One more time, Kurt Andersen and Max Boot.